Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Villanueva, and welcome to the ISACA podcast. I am the IT governance for data resilience, demands an integrated approach to AI, data governance, and cloud. Guy, welcome to the ISACA podcast. How are you today?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to ISACA. All good this side, sunshine and roses. How about there with you?
Oh, sunshine and roses here today in glorious Florida. So I'm really excited about the weather and I'm excited about this topic in particular. Guy, can we start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Professionally, I guess we can start with what I studied. So my university background includes a degree in computer science, a degree in economics and quantitative methods, as well as an MBA in general management, and as well as two ISACA certifications, a C Guide and a C Dipsy. The early part of my career was in computer science, so I started the whole journey as a programmer, which actually, incidentally, engineering, data science, at least for the organizations I was employed by in the early 90s, took a stretch into management as, because it is a quote, as transmittable and storable information by which computer operations are performed. And the reason why I stopped at 1946, and certainly really a path of managing data from its source to ultimately what you do with it when its useful life, has come to an end, and how you ensure that that path which data follows between when it's collected and has its used and when it's disposed of, how you ensure that that is, if there is a disruption, that it doesn't disrupt the operation of the organization. Certainly, it's been an interesting journey just studying the words themselves.
Yeah, I found that interesting. You say 300 years ago. I just hadn't really thought about it and put it in that context of the 1600s. And certainly with data comes.
Data across international borders from or to the European Union from anywhere else. So that has a really big impact on how data is managed and how data is governed. But there could be even more. I mean, think of our, emerging socio political constructs. Even if you think about, and I say political carefully because there is some regulation related to some of the issues that are happening in our society today. But even that can change how we refer to things, even. And if we used to refer to, let's speak about gender as, either male or female today, you might say, oh gosh, is our data complete? How do we react to these kinds of questions? Do we begin to capture different nuances under this? What do we do? And that's more like a shock to the environment. And by shock, it's potentially disruptive. Is, wow, do we change our whole way of thinking around how we process data, what we do with data, how we communicate, how we collect data, even? Just so much. I mean, and those are just some examples of, said the more control change within the organization.
Found that very interesting. But the changes are happening what with hardware and software components. You mentioned regulatory with GDPR and some of the social political.
Because the one thing that drives decision making is often a whole portfolio of assumptions, and some of them you don't even know you're making, but they're assumptions nonetheless. And as a result of these things, a decision is taken based on information that you have at hand. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. You build an artificial intelligence model and it's based on data as at a particular time. And heaven forbid you build your artificial intelligence model where the environment changed the nature of that data. In other words, it's not a static, let's call it a social scenario that it's collected under. But let's say there's a revolution somewhere and a society changes from one form or with one set of norms and behaviors to another over time. That's going to, hang on, if I've got simple linear regression and I'm looking for the best linear unbiased estimator, there's certain assumptions around the nature of the data that you
uphold these key tenets of digital trust, whether it be quality, security, privacy, or ethics. But, talk to us a little bit more about how governance And
be a bit of a longer answer. Let's start with artificial intelligence. Everyone gets excited again about the tool. Let's take the tool and you plop it on a database. Next minute, you've got outcomes and everyone thinks, this is brilliant. We can now make decisions because this artificial intelligence tool is, doing what I think they're doing. Do I just assume, because they're provided by vendor X, that they're perfect? Because remember, those algorithms were produced in a vacuum compared to the environment that you're applying that artificial intelligence over. So think about the things that can go wrong now. So first of all, I'm in AI. I haven't bothered for quality. I make a decision. Boom, it's the wrong decision. I've got reputation risk. Oh gosh, I've got to get social media. I've got to get some kind of PR firm to do some, fancy dancing to ensure that, we made a mistake. It was the wrong data. Or heaven forbid, if you're dealing with a regulator where you're submitting a report to a regulator and the regulator sends a notification of a matter requiring attention or matter requiring immediate attention where this information is wrong. Can we come and have a look and see what you guys are doing because there's something wrong with the reports you're submitting to us? No. So for sure, those things are intrinsically linked.
absolutely.
In a well-governed environment, yeah.
Right. Data, like end to end. So talk to us a little bit about how ignoring or really not paying attention to that metadata, the data and the metadata.
Of interpretation across the organization is a key issue for, again, it's for resilience. Because what's happening here? The potential for making incorrect decisions. And if you've got an incorrect decision, something could happen. I mean, for example, it's an incorrect decision about, we should rather not be pursuing this product anymore. Let's get rid of this product out of our portfolio. And then discovering, oh, gosh, we've gone and, deleted data over time as far as it relates to that product. And suddenly realizing that was a mistake. The data wasn't, the data wasn't of good quality. We misinterpreted what those data elements were. And in fact, we made the wrong decision. And there's an impact on the organization. We've maybe changed staffing. We've maybe changed processes as a result of those. And in fact, it's not just that. What are the governance constructs, not just data governance, but business governance or even IT governance constructs that ensure that all of these are occurring in a well-defined manner that results in outcomes that are not, that are valid, and that protect the organization from things going wrong. It's not to say everything needs to be so perfectly structured, but at least for your basic and core operational processes, that sort of structure is really important to ensure not only around your data quality side or the fit for purposeness of data, but also around the metadata side and ensuring that an approved definition is one that's really gone through an approval process with its segregation of duties between accountabilities and responsibilities, even if it means that in some cases there isn't only one term for a data element that works in an organization. Sometimes there are even synonyms, and synonyms can be permitted. It's not to say there's only one definition, everyone else make sure you move to one definition. That's never going to happen. Synonyms are a big part of operations, and they should be permitted, but they should be available for everyone to see within a metadata construct.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That's really helpful to understand how important it is to also keep in mind the metadata. And as you were responding to that question, you talked a little bit about comparing outcomes, and that got me thinking a little bit about how data resilience would vary, right? Not just within an organization and how things are interpreted, but perhaps also in different economic sectors. Could you give us a little sense for some of those considerations we should keep in mind?
So data resilience, if we think about security in an industry where maybe there's not a lot of personal data, the issues around security and privacy are entirely different to maybe the issues around security and privacy in, let's say, an industry that's in the primary sector. So let's say forestry or fishing or agriculture. Then is you're going to have corporate data. And it may not be deemed sensitive because at least for publicly traded companies, you're going to be able to access various registries that tell you about, yes, this is the company name, this is its registration number, this is its registered trading address, and so on. But certainly the nature of data used in each industry is different. Services industries, or the services sector, and the quaternary sector in particular, which is the knowledge sector, are very highly dependent on data for their products and services, versus the secondary sector, which is manufacturing, and maybe the primary sector, which is your raw materials, maybe don't use data in the same way. They've got a lot more heavy machinery. There's a lot more of those programmable logic control. Important banks are those banks that have been deemed too big to fail. And in fact, the whole scope of data governance and data resilience even is shifting down from those really big multinational banks to even local and regional banks. But that has an impact. And in fact, you find that when that regulation was introduced in 2013, and I think globally systemically important banks needed to have all of those requirements applied by 2018, if I'm not mistaken, so many global banks said, no, we're not ready. So in spite of 5 years having passed, the impact of changes in that regulatory environment within the financial sector were still deemed too big to perform, even over a duration of, as I said, I think it was around about 5 years. And that's just one example. What happens now when you start thinking about how you use data? So there's been such a development in privacy regulation that even things like, at least in Canada, there was an interesting case where a little while ago we had Clearview AI here, maybe it was a year, 2, 3, which was scraping images or likenesses of people off the internet in Canada for part of a facial recognition program. And the Privacy Commissioner said, whoa, hang on a minute, that's data. And Clearview were arguing, but it's publicly available. And they were saying, well, hang on, no, because no one placed their image there, that was placed wherever it was placed for a reason, not for someone else to be coming along and scraping it. And as a result of, I guess, some of the brouhaha that was an outcome of that, Clearview AI left Canada, which introduced all sorts of other challenges. But for sure, in that whole environment, there are a whole lot of impacts, not only in the financial sector, but in other sectors where data is a significant contributor of value to the organization.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that information. It's really helpful. And I think it's important that we note to the listeners that and the viewers that everything that you said also.
I mean, the first thing I think before I get to answer that is for folks to realize that cloud is not a solution to data resilience. And the main reason for that is even cloud vendors have outages. So one of the big selling features of cloud as a data resilience solution is being, we can secure greater uptime. And organizations may feel, great, it's in cloud. I don't have to worry about uptime or downtime management anymore. But if you go and read the literature, there have been major cloud outages at all three major cloud vendors, whether it's Google, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Amazon. And as a result of that, organizations have now had to revert to all of those resilience challenges. It may be a slightly better one. But the other thing vendors were speaking about was the fact that it will cost you less. Well, now if you these things out, these things are so available on the cloud, which has really facilitated AI. Because AI is now easily facilitated. It's now a matter of where's the data I can put into this. And as a result of that, per some of the previous questions you were asking, Lisa, data governance has to come to the fore. So cloud is an enabled AI. AI requires data. Data, in order to be trustworthy, has got to ensure that those data inputs are secure. So certainly these things all tie together very, very tightly. Sorry, there's one that I'm missing. I've got cloud, I've got AI, and data governance. I've got them all three, sorry. All tie very tightly together. In fact, it does have you wondering what would have happened if cloud wasn't there to the development of AI as a sector more recently. Would it have accelerated as quickly as it had? Probably not. But for sure, the fact that, cloud adoption has accelerated AI adoption has had implications for data and therefore for data governance. I mean, these things are very tightly tied together. You can almost not think about these things separately. They are integrated. And don't forget the data resilience piece. The data resilience piece was meant to be that cloud component. But bear in mind, cloud is not 100% answer to resilience. So they tie together, they do different things, but it's interesting how they do converge for sure.
Right, right. And we need to really keep all of those things in mind. I think this is fascinating how the papers really taught us how to think about data and resilience in its more modern context or terminology or definition. So thank you so much, Guy. I want to thank Guy Pierce for joining us here on the ISACA podcast. We're out of time, but hopefully we've whet your appetite to go out and look for that white paper. It's very good information. We're excited about that content. We hope you will be too. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much, ISACA. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Page to Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode.